tonight we're going to do the Sangha, the community of those originally formed around the Buddha, having gone on in many countries and almost on its way arriving in America even today, almost. The American Buddhists mostly don't really have the view of infinite relationality, which is the essential realistic view of Buddhism, meaning that we are here now, having been infinitely interconnected with all beings and with our own deeds and with the ocean of evolutionary biology from the infinite past in the beginningless world, and will continue to be infinitely interconnected in the future, in suffering if we don't awaken, and in bliss if we do awaken. And we don't have that view. We really, even if we intellectually feel that reincarnation may have something to it, maybe something about it, we have subconsciously, we live what in the Tibetan terminology, Buddhist terminology, we are living for this life. We are living for the purpose of this life. We think everything that's going to happen to us is going to happen in this life, and therefore we have this limit at the end of life, death, that death leads to nothing, and then nothing means all consequences are dissolved anyway. And so this is what paralyzes us from really being committed to total evolutionary transformation. And this is what prevents us ideologically from really having American Buddhism. There is no monastic Sangha in America, really, yet. That is to say, there are no monks and nuns who are Americans who are supported by Americans, happily and sort of as a matter of course. Americans still feel socially that there should be no free lunches, people should work and be productive, take care of themselves, this whole thing, and somehow begging is not kosher. And so the monastic institution, which is based on the free lunch, and on the idea that it's an honor to give a free lunch to someone who is truly seeking liberation and enlightenment, therefore that institution doesn't really exist. There are some Asian monks, and then there are a few Anglo, Euro types who are monks or nuns and who hang out with the Asian monks and nuns and sort of get a little extra leftover from the free lunch that we give to the Asian monks because we know that they expect that and they get it from Asians. Do you know what I mean? But we don't really still have it as part of our culture as a normal thing. Like, for example, in Asia, if a monk in Thailand or a nun in Thailand goes to a house, actually there are no nuns in Thailand, they're also chauvinists. They lost the nuns. They have novices, but not real nuns. But so if a monk in Thailand goes to a house and begs for food with downcast eyes, holds out the bowl, a lay person gives the food in the bowl, and the best food in the house they try to give, and they wait before they eat to give it to the passing by monk, and they feel great pleasure and honor to do so. And if the monk were to break the etiquette of that culture and say thank you, they would be annoyed and offended. They don't want to be given back a thank you. They don't want to think I did a great thing. They want to just do it, and the monk just accepts it as a matter of course. And the monk has to eat it, actually. Poor guy, he hopes it's good. But he has to eat it without discriminating about whether it's good or bad, as long as it's not bad for his health, as long as it's not poison. And he can't discriminate. He can't refuse fish or meat, even unless he's allergic to it. Actually, even he cannot refuse whatever it is. He cannot accept meat if he's told to come at a certain time and get that they're going to make a meat feast, and they'll have to slaughter some animal to do it. Then they can't go to the house. It's just a decline. But once they've done their own cooking and everything, he just goes there. He just has to take it, whatever they give him. And so he doesn't say thank you. In America, if a monk begged and then didn't say thank you, the host or hostess would be very offended. With that arrogant monk. Should make their own food. So anyway, those were the two reasons I said there was still not yet an American Buddhism, because we don't have that idea because of the Protestantization, Protestantism having been the sort of demonasticization of the West, of the Northern Europe, and then of the Anglo-America. So anyway, okay, now what I want to talk about today, the Sangha, is really summarizable, which not that I'm going to just read them all and come back to them, but really from this book I wrote, Inner Revolution, is really it is the history of the Sangha in a certain way. I mean, not totally, but sort of the essence of the history of the Sangha, I think, really is what it is. From Proposition 12 in the epilogue, which is 30 axioms, working axioms for realizing and implementing the inner evolution and the politics of enlightenment. From Proposition 12, more or less to the end of those 30, there's 2 or 3 pages, is like the core set of propositions about what is the community, really. Like the first one says, the educational institution Shakyamuni Buddha founded is the jewel community. Sangharatna, I sort of reverse that, usually say the community jewel. You know, the 3 jewels, you have the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, the Sangha jewel, the community jewel. But I turned around and said the jewel community, just for fun. You can sort of do that in Sanskrit a little bit. Meaning the most rare and precious of communities. You know, it is an alternative social world founded on enlightenment, detachment, and love. The ordinary social world is founded on delusion, greed, and anger. Of course, the restraint of those in a way by not, you know, so that one can still live with others without, you know, by containing greed and anger and delusion, but still it's founded on the fact that delusion, greed, and anger are the main drives in people. So it is an alternative social world founded on enlightenment, detachment, and love. It functions on the moral, spiritual, and intellectual levels as the matrix of the new ethics, new religions, and new sciences. New meaning that began from the discovery of enlightenment and from the reorientation of human life to find its meaning in the achievement of enlightenment by individuals and by the community as well, but individual by individual. Then I say in number 13, monasticism is the core of the jewel community. It is an original invention of the Buddha, which I believe to be true. I believe that I actually was the first person to say that too. It spurs society to acknowledge that its highest collective interest is none other than the self-fulfillment of its individuals. You know, that's a very significant thing, you know, the idea of social individualism, which is very confusing. Some of my Buddhist readers are very confused by that because, you know, Buddha's famous for his statement of selflessness and essencelessness and intrinsic realitylessness and identitylessness, all of these things which, you know, are more or less synonymous, meaning that, you know, metaphysically, which means, or really, that is to say, in reality, in nature, there is no indivisible thing. Therefore, there is no undividable thing, no individual, you know, which means an undividable thing, like an atom. That the old idea of an atom means undivided. So there is no such thing because everything is infinitely divisible until it dissolves under the dividing process. And, you know, it's empty in that sense. Therefore, like everything is like an onion, you just keep peeling it and there's no core. Or like a banana tree, you know, that's the Buddhist insight. So then how can such a tradition be individualistic? You see, everyone is very puzzled by that. Puzzling, don't you think? No, it isn't puzzling, it's very simple. Because, you see, if there was an individual that was the real you, not only would you not be individualistic, you wouldn't even be there. Because to be there, you have to be related, you see. But if there was an essence of you that was non-relational, which is what an individual would have to be, couldn't relate, then you couldn't relate to any being, you see, and you couldn't be an individual, and you couldn't even be a collective. You couldn't exist, really. You see, only because you are infinitely divisible are you then nothing more than all of your connections. You see, there's no core to you, but therefore you are all layers, and these layers then go out and then they interconnect with everything around them, you see. But then within that, of being all interconnected, your own part of the interconnectedness, the part that you can deal with yourself, you have to take responsibility for that. Before Buddha's time in India, for example, society was based on the collective, and you were a member of your caste and a member of the society, and you were subject to the gods, and you were part of a unified world, you see. A world where you just had to follow the will of the whole. And the central ritual of the society was sacrifice. And sacrifice is a sort of rehearsal and a symbolism that reinforces the individual's willingness to submerge their own will and their own interest and their own thing into the need of the collective, you see. So therefore it is collectivist, you know. The king in such a society even is supposed to set the example by saying, I only serve the people. You know, heavy lies the head that wears the crown, you know. type of idea, because the king can't do what they want because they just have to do what all the people want, you see. And the Vedic society was like that. And so when Buddha, the beginning of individualism in India, I mean, the very powerful beginning was when Buddha broke away from his family. He broke away from his duty as a father, as a husband, as a son, as a prince, as a warrior. All of them, he broke away. It had such a shattering effect that 800 years later they wrote the Bhagavad Gita to get the guy back in the chariot, Arjuna. He was trying to get out of it too. Arjuna was leaving. Didn't want to kill everybody in the war, but they made him get back in, you see, because they wanted to keep the war effort going, But they couldn't do it for 800 years, took them. So it seems confusing at first, but you see, if you are totally interconnected with everything and there is no separate thing that is you, but ultimately, then relatively you are the one responsible for your separate self. And then it is oppressive to you if you are simply made to submerge that feeling of yourself into some sort of general will. And of course, because there is always some authority that comes and takes over that general will, and then makes you into a slave, basically. And makes you, and then uses you up as part of the process. So therefore, of course, it is a paradox, but life is a paradox. It is a paradox that, for example, if we are an individualistic society, what that means is that the highest purpose of the collective is the individual purposes of all of us. Which means that the society's greatest, highest, consummate duty is to bring each of us as individuals to the highest perfection possible in our lives, the highest fruition in our lives. That means, in a sense, each of us in the part of us that wants the collective to work out wants to support all the others in their fulfillment. And all the others want to support us in our fulfillment. Do you follow me? Collectivism, on the other hand, is where no one is supposed to be fulfilled because everyone is only supposed to support everybody else, but then no other person is supposed to be fulfilled because they're just to be supporting everybody else. So the result is nobody gets fulfilled. You see? You just have a few corrupt dictators who sit up there and slobber like Mao. Slobber on some young girls or slobber around in some food, and they don't even feel fulfilled because they're actually ruining all everybody else's lives. And they feel lousy, really. They just anesthetize themselves with various addictions. So you see, but either one is equally paradoxical in the sense collectivism is also paradoxical. You serve the whole, but then the whole is no other one person. So then actually you're not serving anybody. It's like the communist thing. It's the people's will that we now kill everybody. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the inversion of this, you see. So what we're saying is the dictatorship of the individual, meaning every individual is the supreme purpose of the life of the whole. Do you follow me? Then in that way, the whole really flourishes individual by individual. You see? It's amazing, actually. It's paradoxical, but it is not irrational. So anyway, Buddha discovered that. And in that discovery then, that means that that's a total change of priority, you see, in life. For every person who understands it. The change of, we already discussed it, that's how he got to be Buddha. The change of priority is, your real purpose here is to maximize your own happiness in a durable manner, not just temporary pleasure, but your real happiness. To maximize your fruition, your fluorescence as a being. That is also the greatest thing you can do for everyone else, is to because that's what they all want you to do. Because they wish happiness too. So it is, the community is a community, the Sangha Ratna, our topic for tonight, is the community founded as an alternative social world within a society where no one is getting fulfilled because everybody is it's being demanded on them by the culture, by the unenlightenment-based culture, that is to say, the culture that each one is, in fact, some sort of absolutely separable individual, and therefore everything in the culture is bent on coercing them to just follow the collective good. because everyone feels like a separate being, separate from everybody else. So then in order to live together, they create a culture that suppresses their separateness and suppresses their sense of feeling separate and puts in the center of the culture a sacrificial pit in which things are sacrificed. In the very most ancient time, it was people who were sacrificed. And then later on, cows and horses and goats and sheep and what have you. But basically, it's a symbolic sacrifice of the self, you see, but based on the presumption that the self is the real thing, you see. So everyone has to be suppressed. So then no one can fulfill themselves. Do you follow me? That was the ordinary community. And Buddha, as a cool revolutionary, as I call it, an inner revolutionary, realized that you can't change that by just changing who's on top and who's on bottom. That's absurd, because still no one will be fulfilled. So you replace a monarchy or a tsardom by a collective dictatorship of the proletariat, and it's worse than the tsardom, because the people then who boss it are a bunch of crude characters with not even any training about noblesse oblige, and they become completely rapacious and disgusting and destroy everybody, which is what they did in the last century or two, especially in this century. So he didn't do that. He said, okay, you guys keep doing what you're doing. I know it's very nice, you're all very selfless, and you're all very working for the collective, so keep it up. Keep the machinery going and, like, you know, have a great time. Well, of course, none of you will be fulfilled, but you don't want to be fulfilled. You want to give up your fulfillment. So go ahead, live like that. But a few of us who decide that, gee, there might be something in life beyond cooking and cleaning until death, beyond sitting in a bureaucracy as a boss until death, beyond sitting on a throne and making decisions until death, beyond living a pleasure life until death, there must be something more than that to human life. Those of us who feel that they want to find out something in themselves that's transcendent to that, let them free to do so. And in fact, because they kind of, by doing so, they kind of create a certain openness in themselves, and they create a kind of different degree of jollity around themselves, then they can lighten your burden a little bit. So, you know, enjoy supporting them, actually. And somehow he sold this crazy idea. And as it had never been spotted, you see, that he invented monasticism, because there were ascetics in India before that who would drop out a few men, mostly Brahmins, and a few warriors of those two high castes, who somehow weren't satisfied just fulfilling their role, and then went out into the wilderness and were brave enough to live with tigers and things. They didn't really beg. People eventually, because they had a kind of magical autumn, because they were seeking power. They were seeking godhood. They were seeking to become sort of more powerful than an ordinary human, and it was considered that they were capable of doing that as great yogins. You know, they were cultivating what is called tapas, the ascetic heat. But there was very, very few. And they weren't institutionally supported in a way. And in the Vedas, there are spells and things that the priests who are doing the rituals say to keep them away, because they're afraid of them. These ascetics, these few ascetics, you see. But they had been confused, I think, by scholars of Indian history as being sort of monks or something, those ascetics. But they weren't really monks, because they were wilderness people. They just went right out. They went into a vision of a whole. They were mystics. They went into a vision of the whole that made it unnecessary for them to be with anybody. Whereas the monastic is not working on a vision of the whole. The monastic is interconnected with everybody, but yet wants to have an insulation with that interconnection, and they don't want to go to the wilderness. They want to just live in the suburb within 7 stones throw of the market center. And then they want to come in and be fed, and they're afraid of tigers, and also they want to have women be among them, nuns. I mean, they have their separate place, but they're able to have that access, that option. And then they also want to have it secretly and subversively. They want to have an impact on the society, which they do, because when they come in and get that free lunch, then they give you a little lecture. And they tell you, be a little cool, don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that. Or they tell you a story about, Lassie or Brer Rabbit or something. They had all these Brer Rabbit and Lassie stories. And so that's a subversive impact in the society, Very subversive, because they also can beg whatever caste they may have originally come from. All marks of caste are removed from them. They're shaven, they're clean, they wear the same robe, personality-lessness in a way, although they had new names, they had new monastic names, but their gender can be perceived, but otherwise they are not perceivable in any normal identity, and so therefore a person who in the rigid caste system cannot eat at the same table with someone of a different caste, cannot take food from them, cannot give food to them, cannot touch them even, cannot have their shadow fall on them. They were so phobic about caste in India at Buddha's time. And yet here suddenly someone comes who's completely unidentifiable within that network, and then you must feed them. Which is incredibly subversive to your rigid sense of separateness from others, in fact, in a very sneaky way. It was very sneaky, this community. And that's why, and that's why Buddha was able to found this amazing community. Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee, the historian, he says about the Buddha that he was amazed in his reading of the activities of what he calls the ethical protesters, the ethical reformers of the mid-5th century before the Common Era, all over Eurasia and Egypt, which were these great teachers like Isaiah, Socrates, Plato, Confucius, Zoroaster, all roughly in the same century or so. And these great teachers, all of them were changing completely the whole mores of their different societies, and in fact founding principles and things which are still the governing principles in all of those streams, like the Chinese, the European, the Indian. The people of that era were the founding people. And of all those people, only the Buddha managed to start a huge community, openly, without it being a priestly community. Buddha forbade all of his monastic people to do rituals for people, to tell fortunes for people, to preside over marriages or birth ceremonies for people, to even to develop relationships by going twice to the same house to bake lunch in a row. I mean, I guess they could come back and rotate back in a month or two, but constantly to be on the move, so to speak. I mean, as a pure principle, he set that as a founding principle to precisely avoid developing priestly, class-like relations with people, although, of course, later on in the history of Buddhism, Buddhists did become priests in different places. I mean, nothing ever stays perfect. But the point is, in the founding principle, there is this sort of social principle of not competing, and also by not competing with the Brahmin priests in performing those life ceremonies for people, he didn't bring down the wrath of the Brahmins and did not get himself crucified or burned or killed by them. So it was he was incredibly intelligent as a sociologist, as a manager of institutions, because precisely he was trained to be a king. And when he realized the vanity of being a king and how the limited positive impact you could have on people's lives as a king, and he found a way of having a much greater impact of bringing to them the idea of freedom, he yet organized things in a kingly way, and he devised an institution that actually conquered the world, in his view, unless it's totally been destroyed today and never will return, which is possible. So his conquest may have ended 100 years ago. It is possible. It was the majority world religion 100 years ago. Now it's nearly disappeared. Although according to the prophecy, that means now its principles may become very widespread, actually. But it doesn't look like it, I certainly agree. You see, if you are totally the sum of your relations and your deeds and your actions, and there's no you that is absolutely separated, that is somehow, however, belonging to a certain caste or gender or some sort of identity, member of some sort of a group, then that means you are responsible for what you become. There's no static way of just saying, well, I'm just going to be the daughter of my mother or the son of my father and to do exactly what he did, and then I'm just part of, and I never change, kind of. I have this unchanging essence that just goes on like that, which means non-individualistic, because I'm fixed, so there's no need for me to care for myself in a way. And any impulse I have to do so is a delusion, and I just sacrifice it, you see, along in the ritual of the society, you see. But if, on the contrary, I am only what I make of myself, how I connect with things, then I have to take responsibility for connecting with positive things and disconnecting from negative things. I must look out for my self-interest to that degree. For example, how does a king coerce people to go out and kill themselves and kill other people in order for that king to gain a province or like some acres of real estate, which his son or grandson will lose again to the enemy, or will over-farm, or will destroy, or whatever? How does they get people to throw their lives away in that minor pursuit of gaining a couple of acres? or keeping a couple of acres? Well, they tell them, that is your duty. You're a member of the warrior group. The god of the group will take care of your soul, which the god has a string attached to, which doesn't change anyway because it's just a warrior soul. And, it's disconnected from what you do in a way, but therefore you might as well do what we tell you. And then you go do that, and that's been what you've done. You've fulfilled your purpose. You did your drone-like, ant-like purpose. You went over, you got killed. But then you're taken care of because your soul is put up in the tomb of the unknown soldier or Arlington Cemetery, and then your body, or the ashes, and then the garbage is put there, and then the soul is plucked up by the god and placed in the Valhalla. Fine, end of story. If, on the other hand, you say, I have no such essence, nobody can take me to Valhalla, and there's no way of staying mortally place in some Valhalla. I am a product of what I do. I go out, I become trained, I become insensitive, I become casual of others' lives, I kill a lot of other people, I die in a state of terror and rage, and then I connect to circumstances that are brought to you when you are in a state of terror and rage. And I'm in armor and this and that, so I might be reborn as a beetle with armor part of my body. Because I love, because somebody killed me by piercing my armor, so I want to have a thicker armor, so I'm reborn as a rhino or something. Because I admire that form. See, I drive a tank in the Gulf War and go around and bat. Then I'm reborn as something in a tank-like embodiment with stingers that sting out there because I'm identified with my tank. I drive a B-52 and I drop bombs. I become some kind of weird dragonfly because I want my B-52 back. So then, that's individualism. I say, forget it, king. Go fight for your own acres if you think they're so important. I have an amazing human life, a piece of biology, which I can flower into an amazing butterfly of a Buddha. And I can create acres of land and give to everybody. I can become like this thing beyond the gods, a true gem and mine and jewel and dynamo of happiness for beings. And that's what I'm going to do with my life, and forget about it, you go get your own acres. That's individualism, you see. Minimally, even if I don't have the idea that I can do all those magical things like in the Mahayana, at least I will remove myself as one of the combatants on the battlefield. And I will seek a nirvana. I will set an example for others to drop out and not to do that. And then, gosh, if lots of us do that, Your Majesty, I guess you would have to look elsewhere for your cannon fodder. And if you have to look elsewhere for your cannon fodder, your neighbor will have to look elsewhere for his cannon fodder, and you guys will, stop having to have wars, I guess. But the Buddha didn't spell that out to the king, so he wouldn't have been so popular. So monasticism, it spurs society to acknowledge that its highest collective interest is none other than the self-fulfillment of its individuals. The enlightened individual's deliberate persistence in this total renunciation of the ordinary social world is itself the most radical and powerful of all political acts, grounding the politics of enlightenment and the inner revolution solidly on the preeminence of the transcendent. That is to say that somehow there is something higher for all of us than the sort of normal struggle, day-to-day struggle. That's the most powerful sign of that, is that sort of transcendence, that sort of renunciation. Then the monastic core provides the cocoon for the free creativity of the lay men and women of the jewel community, who also belong to the jewel community, but which needs special assistance to maintain its enlightenment principles in confrontation with the militaristic harshness of the ordinary social world. In the Mahayana sense, something about the process of enlightenment, this paradox that we're dealing with, is actually the deeper thing that I want to really deal with, because when you realize your own selflessness, your own lack of divisibility, and in fact you have an experience, the enlightened experience is an experience where you do feel others as yourself, and you do feel yourself as others. And this is often, unfortunately, mistaken by mystics to mean that the enlightened person, and this is why psychologists, Western psychologists, are afraid of enlightened people. And like Freud considered enlightenment a dangerous delusion. I don't know if you know the future of an illusion, they call the oceanic feeling, how terrible and awful it was. He thought it was an infantile thing. He committed what Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy. He confused the trans-egoic insight with the pre-egoic lack of having developed any sense of separateness or self-responsibility or self-definition, relative self-definition. The mystic thinks that that experience means something like where you and everyone else are obliterated and yet you're all one, but none of you exist, or something like that. So it's a kind of oceanic feeling where you sort of don't differentiate yourself from anything and you don't differentiate anything else from yourself. So therefore we're all one, but none of us are there again, this kind of idea. So enlightenment is not like that. Enlightenment actually is where you feel yourself the other, and you feel the other yourself, and yet you simultaneously remain aware of at least a relative distinction between the self and other. It's like, in a sense you could say, my hands are part of me, but each finger wiggles on its own, normally. Normally. I can have some defects where I think I'm wiggling this one, and this one wiggles, that happens. Or I can be paralyzed, many things. But basically, it's not that impossible. That's sort of paradoxical. How can they be my fingers and yet operate separately? You see, wiggle differently. So similarly, this finger has a little bit of its own intention there. It wiggles over here. This one wiggles over here. And jugglers can do all kinds of weird wiggles, which we normally can't do because we have less fine motor attention to that, or less sort of ability to decontrol it in a way. So similarly, enlightenment, the sense of oneness in enlightenment is balanced, is coordinated non-dualistically with a responsible sense of differentiation. And the mystic always thinks that enlightenment is just a big soup-like ocean state. There is an ocean type of state, but that ocean type of state is non-dual from the differentiated state, actually. Basically, really. But we've talked about this, remember? In talking about the Dharma and talking about Buddha, we said that the tendency is to read the Buddhist texts. Even people will write them who are Buddhists, thinking that, that the enlightenment is a collapsed state. It's a collapsed state of being sort of obliterated, like all to the absolute, all to emptiness, or it's a collapsed state that there is no emptiness and then just all to just being normal. And you can read Zen, first there are mountains and rivers, then there are no mountains and no rivers, then again there are mountains and rivers. But then the danger is that people will think, well, they're just the same mountains and rivers they were there before, but boy, they aren't. The mountains and rivers, the third mountains and rivers are the mountains and rivers that are also not mountains and rivers at the same time. That's a very different bunch of mountains and rivers. They are self-transparent mountains and rivers. They are mountains and rivers that are you as mountains and rivers, which means you and you self and your other simultaneously being there in some way, on an equal level. The reason that other is such a big problem to us in our unenlightened state is that we think that self is the only real thing. The mountains and the rivers are different from us. The other people are different from us, just different, as absolutely different from us as we feel from all of them. Then there are people, then there is self and other, you see. Then there's no self and other, meaning that we have a realization of the real sameness, just like I now have a certain realization about my hand. I suddenly have a realization about all of you just as if you were my hand. Although it's a little bit weirder than that, lucky for you, because I also have the feeling that I'm just the hand of all of you at the same time. And then again, there is self and other, you see. But that second self and other is a self and other that is simultaneously non-different. That is a self and other where, but what would that mean? That doesn't mean that then there is a self and other which are still not existing. That's the second stage where there's no self and other. But again, there is self and other means that would be really different, wouldn't it? If you look at the other, you look at me, I look at you, and I don't feel that I'm all you. And I don't feel that you're all me. But I feel that you are equally you as I am me. Suddenly we're just totally equal, you see. There's as much life in you as in me, in my feeling, you see. And your life in you is your life, not mine. And yet it's equally yours as mine is mine. Wouldn't that be different? You see, that would be really different. Totally different. Buddha is not a religious founder, particularly, as we've said here, as you know. He was not particularly setting up a belief system. On contrary to most prophets, who go out and then they meet somebody else who knows everything, namely God, and then they become the vessel of that God, and they go out and proclaim the truth of that God, and they say that God's got it under control, and all you have to do is believe in it, and He'll save you, or goddess. There's some with goddesses. But Buddha went and found that God didn't have it under control, although he was powerful, he could play around, but he didn't really know what he was doing exactly, because he thought he was more real than anybody else. Precisely, he had that problem, and then Buddha had an experience, broke through to an understanding where he totally understood everything, and he didn't mince words. He said, "I understand the whole thing perfectly. I'm Buddha. I woke up. I understand it all." And then they said, "Really?" They said, "Yeah, but you're not supposed to believe me when I say so. Don't believe it that I say so. Don't believe anything that anybody says," he says. That's the first thing I tell you from my understanding of everything is, don't believe anything anybody tells you. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't, for example, take on credit something to try out. Like when you put on when someone gives you a shoe, you're not supposed to believe that that's the best shoe in the world, but you might try it. If you think it maybe is good, you wear it and feel how it works, walk in it, test it out, and then you might accept the shoe. So similarly, things that people suggest to you, then you evaluate, you think about, you explain and re-explain, you debate with it inside yourself, you test it in your experience, and if it begins to make sense, if it begins to have an impact in your experience that is positive, then you say, well, that was useful. Buddha said he knew everything, meaning that as a scientist, that's the ultimate scientific achievement. None of this unified field theory and all this kind of like final string and like press the button and you have the final experiment and get the Nobel Prize. They should give Buddha the Nobel Prize because he actually directly understood everything, every single atom, every energy, every chemical, everything. Every organ in the body, how it works, which gene went here and that and there and the other. Totally understood everything. But then he said everyone else has to understand it for themselves. And they don't even have to believe that I did, although it is useful to change the preconception. So the point is that everyone has to discover the truth for themselves, but it does help if there is the possibility, the hope, the model that they actually can understand something. Now, in the West, there was the idea that there was a God who understood everything, and the mind of God had the knowledge of everything complete, right? God was omniscient, omnipotent, right? And created everything and knew everything. So there was a model of a total understanding, but that was inaccessible to any human being. So a human being could only take on faith what was stated through authorities in scriptures, in things that were believed to be the direct statements of God, and then interpreted by authorities, and then they had to pursue a system theoretically where they could never come to such an understanding. And the mystics would somehow maybe achieve a feeling of oneness with God in some way, but still in that oneness, God was still the big other who knew everything, and they just felt one, but they didn't know what God knew. A few felt that they really did know what God knew, like John Donne, or a few people. They usually ended up on a rack somewhere. Then the scientists broke away from that. They said that's a bunch of BS. Or they got into that thing of where God wound it up and then took a hike. Like Thomas Jefferson, the deists, and the Enlightenment. God started all that like a watchmaker. The Swiss, they loved that. Their watchmaking. And then he left. Went to Switzerland on permanent vacation. So then it's up to us to try to figure out what he did. You see, but then the key about the sciences is then the preconception is you'll never know what it is. That's really convenient when you depend on soft money, because you can endlessly go back and get more grants. At the end of the grant, you don't have to come up with a definitive conclusion. You say, well, we did all these things. We wasted all these monkeys and rats and many things, and we know even less than we did before, so we need another 10 billion. I love it. I just am waiting to see what's going to happen when they finish with their genome and all this, and it's like, well, gee, They're going to find inside the genome, they're going to find in some little gremlins in there. They're going to have a new thing to encode what the gremlins are doing. A new subcode under there, under the genome when they get down to the subatomic level of the molecules. Hopeless business, hopeless. But the point is that it is nice to know that the person who claimed to understand everything said, we can understand it sufficiently to truly find satisfaction. We can, for example, with medicine, the earth is medicine. It produces plants that are medicine. It has minerals and waters and sun rays and energies that are medicine. Even the poisons in the earth are medicine and may be used in a tiny way. If you have the knowledge to know how to use them, and if you know what your body is, and then you can connect yourself with what will keep your body in balance. And this can be known, and everyone can know it, actually. Every human being, theoretically can know that. That's a different, and yet, of course, then there's always more and more to know. There's always better ways to know, and each person can know something specifically for themselves, which will be something unique and different. That's kind of fun, I think. But anyway, I wanted to do something with what the Dalai Lama said on the 8 verses for training the mind, instead of just following my own propositions about the history of the jewel community. I wanted to show this thing. He said to me, the Dalai Lama announced to me that he was a Kadampa. It's the first time I've ever heard him say he was something. Kadampa. Yes, he said that, I learned something new in Tibet that I had never noticed in my studies, which is wonderful. There's always so much more to learn. He said something in a talk in English, saying that really what he was talking about Tibet and like trying to the plight of his people and trying to do some negotiating with the Chinese government and failing as usual, China's refusing and all this. And because of the refusal of the foreign, he didn't say this, but I'm saying because of the refusal of any foreign government to really put pressure on the Chinese to really stand up for the Tibetans. But anyway, he was talking about it, and then he said, but really, I'm just a simple monk, he said. I'm just a simple monk. And what I really want to do is I want to go away in a quiet place and take a break like a wounded animal likes to withdraw into like a sort of a sanctuary, like a little cave or something to lick its wounds. So I was like, the audience went like that, So then at some other point, when I managed to sneak through the cordon of bodyguards and things and various kinds of like big highfalutin secretaries and things, and we were hanging out somewhere waiting to go into something. I said to him, Your Holiness, I said, you really startled a lot of us with that image of being like a wounded animal and getting away to your lair, I said, oh no, that was no big deal. I said, we always say that, and it says, Jidag, mebatavu. And I said, what do you mean, Rida mebatavu? Mebatavu is like a wounded animal. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, oh, that's if you didn't know that. And then he rattled off a verse from the early Kadampa order, which was the order founded in Tibet in the 11th century. And they were sort of the great, around the time of Milarepa, but a little before, these were the great sort of St. Francis's, really, of Tibet, And his first incarnation in Tibet was the founder of that order, actually. His name was Drom Dumba. Drom. The teacher Drom Dumba, his name. And then he says, I am a Kadampa after all. I said, well, that's great, Your Holiness. I'm glad to learn that. But please, Western people don't know that little saying that you're just translating, that everyday common saying that the Buddhist monk always wants to be, it feels sort of wounded by the samsara and wants to withdraw, like a wounded animal, to lick its wounds. And when the Western people hear you say that, they think, oh my goodness, the Dalai Lama is really upset. Oh, he said. And laughed and said he would take that under advisement. So, but anyway, this has to do with community, because what we're talking about tonight, community means the whole question of self and others. You see, true community, this community, the jewel community, is founded on total individualism. Imagine a community where we all want the absolute best for each of each other. And actually, we can also expect that every other single person wants the best for us. Basically, that is the definition of a Buddha land. Remember in the Vimalakirti, I think I read you a little bit in the Dharma when I was teaching the Mahayana about how in the Buddha land of a Buddha, instead of people being stingy and worrying about their possessions, everybody wants to give away everything to everybody else. Because they have reached a kind of generosity. Even the land wants to give itself away to everyone. And so in such a place, you no longer worry about wealth or about possessions. In fact, except that you want to give them away to everybody. Because this Buddha land, therefore, would be, as I said, and I think I said this in the previous lecture here, would be like a food fight universe. Everybody would be throwing creme caramel at each other. Really sloppy business. Because everyone would want everyone else to enjoy something, you see. And then that means you'd have all this food flying at you. So obviously then if you live cosmically in such a state, it would be a place where the energy was flowing. You yourself would not be concerned with grasping anything at yourself. You would be this kind of opening, like this, your pattern of energy would be opening, but you'd be getting so much more energy than we now get in a world where everyone is closing and then trying to grab more from the other and then fighting them, you see. And that's our world of scarcity, the world of ignorance, you see. But this other world is the world of giving everything, you see. And it's founded, you see, then Buddha so brilliantly invented the monastic jewel community with the monastic at the core, with a layer outside that where they were lay people, so they had to earn a living and be more similar to the way that people outside behave, but with a different motivation, with a way of sort of getting some of that wealth and giving it to the people who were giving it all away. And then the core of that jewel community are the people who have given up everything. You see, the monk or nun who lives at the foot of a tree, who eats only what is given, eats only once a day what they're given for that day, fasts if necessary, although seeks the gift, though, to relate to others by seeking the gift, seeks the opening in the other by getting the gift of the food, doesn't seek to annihilate themselves. Completely different community. You know, monks, it is, when I first met some Buddhist monks and began to live with them, that's why I wanted to be a monk. It was such an amazing thing, because you're suddenly with people who don't want anything from you. I mean, the real people. I'm saying there are fake monks. There's greedy monks. They want you to start a restaurant or something for them and, work on their farm type of thing. But those are fake monks. The real monks don't want anything, actually. And they also don't want that much for themselves. Maybe some of them are greedy after knowledge. They study a lot or something, or meditate a lot, or want to experience it. But in a way, they've done a lot, and they're realistic, and they sort of just hang out. And for someone brought up in our society of like achieve and do and move and get and go, suddenly to be hanging out with a bunch of people who are like, yeah, right. It's like they're like cool. Let's go have some free lunch, what the heck, or let's not bother. They don't have a big purpose going on. It's an amazing experience. And therefore, people in those societies where those people treat them like a jewel, because then you can suddenly release some of your layers of anxieties and duties and obligations and what you need to do and drivennesses, you see. So it creates a sort of space in the group of someone who's not seeking that. The jewel community is based on our mutual idea, awakening to the possibility that we can become completely different beings without selfish drives at all. And that way we will be truly happy, and we can do that. And therefore, I want you to do that. And I expect you want me to do that. Which is a kind of reciprocity, but it's different. As I said, it's paradoxical. It's a reciprocity where everybody wants the highest for everybody else, and they expect that everybody else wants their highest. Which in a way is what individualism is, or democracy is. It's the same. Why democracy is such an unwieldy system? Because everyone is king in a democracy. You know the image of Thomas Paine, where he said, you take the crown and smash it and give everybody back the jewel, piece of one of the jewels, and everyone is king. See? Well, of course, that's impossible. Therefore, from the beginning of democracy, every fascist, every tyrant has said, this is ridiculous, it's a joke, it's hopeless, it'll never work. But that's because, in a way, they're, in the ordinary society, in a way, it is kind of hopeless, in a way. But anyway, the Buddha founded this other society, and he did it very correctly, and it did flourish in spite of what some anthropologists might have said, for thousands of years. And it transformed actually Asian societies. Anthropologists also define religion as, pattern maintaining systems of belief and ritual. By the way, just so you know, I don't know if, I'm sure you know that. Do you know that? Clifford Geertz and these people? That's how they define religion. They don't really have any room, secular anthropologists, for concepts of transcendence. They're not really there in anthropological definitions of religions. What Tucker Parsons called pattern transcending things. They don't really fit in. That's mysticism, so that's not religion. You see. I don't mean to not take anthropology seriously. I especially like sociology, actually. But anthropology there's a lot of useful things about it, but they haven't really covered. The anthropologists who have studied Tibet, for example, they just think the monks are a big bother. They do. They're mostly sort of Marxist. He was a kind of anthropologist, and they think this opiate of the people thing, really, and all those monks and nuns, how could anybody have supported them? Must have really be dumb. And all these worthless, useless people sitting around there on their free lunch, just like getting fat and doing nothing. And just bothering the government and preventing the government from having a nice self-defense force and like being in reciprocity with the nations around them and therefore surviving nicely like a good solid country and getting rid of all those dumb monks and nuns. That's what they've all said, basically, all the anthropologists. Therefore, they have agreed with the Marxist condemnation of Tibet as a feudal theocracy. And they've assumed that they've allowed that communist propaganda against Tibet that it was all a bunch of Borgias, kind of like sitting around, like slurping down some momo, some burgers, yak burgers, while the people slaved and toiled, which is completely false. The people loved those people. I'll never forget Necho Rinpoche. I mean, what I'm trying to convey, it maybe can be conveyed by this great Lama I used to know, late Lama. His incarnation is also very cute, a little boy now. But called Necho Rinpoche, who had lived for years in China. He went with the Dalai Lama and his delegation in 1953-4, and then he stayed on for a number of years negotiating there, sort of representing the Tibetans in Beijing with the communists, and got to know them well and lived and saw China going through its different great leaps and its weird things, in the 50s, before coming back to Tibet, late in the 50s, and then luckily for him escaping to India. And then he was traveling here in the States, and then someone in the States asked him, they said, well, how do you like the United States? This was in the 70s, when people in America were still more into, if possible, even more into how we are the greatest, we Americans. And so he said, how did you like the States? Like, well, you must really love it, type thing. And he said, oh, it's really beautiful. The cars, the roads, the houses. Oh, it's beautiful, he said. And then he said, except it reminds me a little too much of communist China. Everybody's like, oh, shock must have happened with this man. And they said, well, Rinpoche, what do you mean? And he said, well, America's much nicer. And you have much more wealth here, he said. But America's just like communist China in the sense that everybody in the whole country has no time at all. Totally busy. Rush, 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 work, work, work. I go to a house of even a wealthy person, and they're talking on the phone at the table. They say, hello, Rinpoche, sit down, and they run out the door. And they got to get to the place, do this, do that. Nobody has any time. Nobody takes a break. You're all frenetically busy. In China, they're rushing around production brigades 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Rush, 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 march, march, march. He said, I don't know what it is with the both of you. He says, in Tibet, we really knew how to do nothing. He says, sure, we worked hard. He had come from a village. He was the son of a villager. Although he was a High Lama because he was a reincarnation, eventually he became a High Lama, but he was the son of a villager. And he said, sure, we worked hard. We would have harvests, we would plant, we would plow, we would build some building or a temple or make some statue or something. And we would prepare for some festival or something. But then, in between, for months, we'd watch the barley grow. We would hang around, And when we were monks, we would study hard for exams, we'd debate, we'd pass exams, we'd read late at night, and then we would just do nothing, just hang out. The horizon for progress and development and whatever accumulation was internally. Maybe we would meditate. Some people would go on retreat. Then they would be doing production of meditation. But there was a general atmosphere because 20% monastics. 20%, imagine if 20% of the people in this country were honored for doing nothing. It was like such a shock to me, I remember. Having been to all these schools and studying like 75 hours a day for so many years. So the person who has got no worldly purpose becomes a jewel for people who are caught up in the pressures of worldly purposes. And if they are not able themselves, or for some reason don't catch it in such a way that they realize that the dropping of all worldly purpose and the putting of all that purposiveness into evolution of themselves, primarily. Although, of course, there is a stage, and this is what I wanted to come to, there is a stage where that evolution of themselves must proceed by interacting with others. There is a stage, then again, where the individual finds that fulfillment in fulfilling, helping the other individual to fulfill. Where there's just so many meditations for yourself, so much knowledge you can accumulate for yourself, so much wisdom you can generate and insight for yourself, and then it becomes helping others to generate it. When you reach a kind of satisfaction of a certain type that people sort of know when they reach. The 8 verses for training the mind by Geshe Langri Tangpa, written in the 11th century, I think. Still 11th, early 12th. One of the early Kadampa monks, which the Dalai Lama gave a teaching on, and which he thinks is such a great thing. By thinking of all sentient beings as even better than the wish-granting gem for accomplishing the highest aim, may I always consider them precious. Now see, this is then the second level I'm talking. This is Mahayana. Once the community is firmly established in India, it took about 400 years, during which time the Buddha really kept pounding on and emphasizing, the Buddhist community did. Actually, the Buddha, they say, had given other teachings that he told people to keep them a little quiet for a few centuries. And then the people just pounded on this idea of do your own purpose in this life. Appreciate yourself. Excuse yourself from such and such a worldly obligations as much as possible. As much as you can understand and be inspired to use your life's energy to open up your life. To reach a stage where you will be free of ever having a life that is closed and enslaved and entrapped and imprisoned. Achieve full freedom in your heart and in your mind through wisdom, through generosity and charity, and full happiness from that freedom. And then you will never be trapped. You will never be trapped in one of these life forms, of the 6 life forms, where you will suffer, complete sort of drivenness. And here are the monks and nuns sitting listening to the Buddha. This is the best place to escape from this wheel of compulsive embodiment, life after endless life, after beginningless life, driven by the unconscious impulses of the delusion, lust and hatred, the pig and the cock and the snake. So he hammered on that for 400 years. They all did. I mean, all the Buddhist leaders and the community. And the community expanded hugely. And the Emperor Ashoka realized what a gem it was within his society to have this escape valve, this freedom engine in the middle of the society where the person from the oppressive family could go and get away from the oppressive father or the oppressive grandmother, whatever, whoever, oppressive brother, whatever it was. The soldier who couldn't get off his Vietnam syndrome from the many wars that happened in India and was like a danger to people's lives and turning into a danger of turning into a brigand and a bandit could go there and could take that energy and could calm themselves and find peace and transcendence. Everyone could find, to have that in the middle of society, more and more of these asylums and these educational centers where people could raise the quality of their virtue and their sensitivity to others, and open to each other in a different kind of a way, because not fearing of trying to get things from each other. Such a jewel within the society was triply precious, and so Ashoka made it completely, allowed it to spread, to funded many establishments and asylums of this type, centers of learning and education, and the later Indian kings did too. But then they reached a point, and then they reached a point where the society was so much more loosened out that it became then possible for people to think about letting down that shell of defensiveness and be more open with each other, even in the midst of their daily activities, even in the midst of the office. In fact, they began to be able to consider the possibility that being a little more selfless even in normal worldly would make those even better interactions and more effective. Businesses would make more money. You know, armies would do better because they wouldn't have to be called on, because people would be more friendly to each other. There would be less crime, more generosity, more sharing. So then you have what's called the Mahayana. In other words, by more individualism and by more of an education of people to seek the highest goal for themselves in life, the society became much more supportive of that, even in the lay sector. And therefore, people could do that, wouldn't have to necessarily first stress so much getting away from everyone to really work on themselves. They could start working on themselves while staying interconnected with other people. And then finally, therefore, they could turn to the second level of Buddhahood, the level that the Mahayana begins to introduce, where you're not only seeking enlightenment as a freedom of the mind, but you're also seeking a higher embodiment. You're seeking the enlightenment of the body in compassion. In other words, wisdom is not the main thing only, but also compassion becomes a main virtue, a main thing to develop. Compassion which is expressed in the body, expressed in interaction with others, compassion. In order for there to be compassion, there has to be someone who suffers. And there has to be, therefore, the wish to help them, free them from that suffering. So there have to be other people. You can't be compassionate without another person. Of course, there always are endless numbers of other beings, so you really don't have to worry. Coming to these 8 verses, by thinking of all sentient beings as even better than the wish-granting gem for accomplishing the highest aim, meaning the aim of total evolutionary fulfillment of self and other, total happiness of all beings becoming Buddha, may I always consider them precious. Wherever I go, with whomever I go, may I see myself as less than all others, and from the depth of my heart may I consider them supremely precious. You see, this is the thing. You see, we came to a certain point, didn't we, earlier, where I think we made it very clear. We said, you know, you meet people, but you really know more of your life than them, except in those rare moments of love, of having children, some maybe occasionally with a parent, and they're really over the hill and they're not being in pain anymore, and rare moments. You know. Otherwise, you're there, and they are less live than you, except as you remind yourself in various ways. Because you're just mainly focused on your life, like what should I do, where should I go, what am I wearing, what do I need? I mean, that's how the mind ruminates like that. This is called self-cherishing. It's something a little different from the actual raw kind of self-identity habit, the sort of self-perception, the bare sense of yourself as being the center, which is, in a way, a root, connected to the root of it, although there's a way of seeing the other as the root. Self-cherishing, in other words, granted that given that sense of myself is here, it's then the constant worry about myself and how am I here, and how does it go, and how am I, and the self-importance, self-obsession, self-preoccupation. We all know that one. We certainly know that one. We wake up with it. What should I do today? What can I do? What should I avoid? How can I go? How is this doing? How is that? Evaluating how we are. Because when we evaluate only our happiness all the time, we find it very deficient. And there's no time you can have any pleasure of any kind, and then you stop from just having the pleasure, and you decide how much is it, it immediately destroys it. Immediately. And yet that's what we always do. Comparing, was it as good this time as the last time? How could it be better? What went wrong? Etc. Boom, it's over. Any pleasure. So this is another level of immediately going and tackling this issue right away. It's the compassion training. In Shantideva, it's called the replacement of self-cherishing with others cherishing. It's called the exchange of self and other, the exchange of self-cherishing for other cherishing. And remember, we said that enlightenment was a state where you finally actually see the other as equal to yourself. Much more challenging than just you dissolving and them dissolving, and it's all one vast soup and you can't find anybody in there. You can't even find the person who didn't find anybody, which is actually a tremendous relief temporarily. It's like better than a deep sleep. Suddenly, boom, it's all gone. On that level of where we were thinking that it all was, which was that level where you clutch it as an absolute thing in itself. Suddenly, it's like you're squeezing on water with all your might, and then suddenly you realize that, why am I making a dent in my palm? Because there's nothing in my hand. And then there's suddenly a tremendous release and relief. So that's not that mystic state of void, the semblance of voidness, the sky-like equipoise semblance of voidness is, of course, a very pleasant and releasing state. But it itself, taken as a state apart from everything that itself that is empty, is, of course, a false construction of some sort of a disconnected void, which it couldn't be disconnected, in fact, obviously, because we experience it. Therefore, we enter it, and we leave it. So, in fact, it's not disconnected. It's that there's a doorway into that experience, but that's a good experience. It dissolves the rigidity of the self-absolutization and the other absolutization. But then the more important awareness is the awareness that we said is the one that's made possible by the squeezing together of the sky-like equipoised experience and the dream-like differentiated experience, where the differences of self and other return, but now are like a dream. There's still a difference, but it's not this thing of I'm really here and I have to somehow make a mental effort to realize that you're there. In the dreamlike thing, your there-ness is as much to me as my there-ness. Now, before I have necessarily achieved that enlightenment, though, another method of reaching it, which is not just from the method of critically seeing through everything and finding its emptiness, but is a method of replacing my constant focus on my own interior with a focus on the other, an imagination of the other. Actually, I didn't mean to go so far into it, but I will. In the practice of the exchange of self and other is a very brilliant thing, where you look at your relations with others on just a very honest way, and you realize that they're always spoiled by one of three things. Whenever you meet anybody, or you spend any time with any of them, you measure them and evaluate them instantly, without just as a reflex, totally. And you either locate them as your inferior in some way, your equal, which is hard, but in some way, or, and the worst, for a red-blooded American, you're superior in some way. And the minute you do, if you locate them as your inferior, you condescend to them immediately. You kind of a little bit despise them, which sounds harsh, but you do. You kind of don't account them much, as we say. If you perceive them as your superior in any way, you're immediately envious. Well, who do they think they are? They got a couple of bucks, or they have a pretty nose, or they have like a diamond earring, or they have a better car, or they live so-and-so. Well, I bet they're not so great. Immediately, envy. And you see them some way equal, and then it's like, how can I elbow them ahead? How can I compete? Rivalry and competition, immediately. True? Yeah. I'm sorry. We are trained like that. We are conditioned like that. The ego habit, not the ego necessarily, but the ego habit makes us do that. So, but that then, this is something we never thought of. Every single person that we meet and measure like that, more or less, some will have discordant views, but more or less, they will have the equal opposite reaction. That is to say, the one we feel envious of will, because people have such a much deeper knowledge of everything, just subliminally, they pick up so many details and cues about each other, way beyond whatever they don't have to look at each other's driver's license. And and there's so much information about that are all cued in there, prejudice of many kinds. So then you see someone you feel jealous, they despise you. You see someone you feel condescending to, they're jealous of you. You see someone you're rivaling with, they rival you. More or less, likely. So in this sense of beginning to see the other and become more attuned to the other and more obsessive about the other, preoccupied with the other, there's a meditation where you go around visualizing, empathizing with others. It's an exercise. I mean, you don't let on. You don't say, oh, by the way, I'm seeing myself from your eyes. You don't say that. You try to hang out, because you probably end up keeping a low profile, being a little bit quiet because you're concentrating another way. It's a little complex exercise. But you begin to see yourselves from the eyes of jealousy, of contempt, and of competitiveness. This apparently has a very profound effect on how you treat other people. Because naturally, you want to elicit from them, you would like them not to regard you in these ways. So you begin to feel that maybe you shouldn't be regarding them in these ways. And then in a way, because it's almost insoluble not to, you then begin to get into a thing where you try to be more with them than with yourself. You begin to cultivate that empathy, that ability to imagine the other. And of course, this is natural if you achieve the radical insight into selflessness, and hence the selflessness of others, then you will perceive the equality of self and other in a certain way, built in with the bliss of wisdom, of freedom from self, and this naturally happens. But short of that, this is a very powerful compassion thing. And particularly, it's so great here, and it connects, I want to connect it to the community thing, because I think it's so crucial. May I examine my mind in all actions, and as soon as a negative state occurs, since it endangers myself and others, may I firmly face and avert it. When I see, now this is the hard part, when I see beings of a negative disposition or those oppressed by negativity or pain, may I, as if finding a treasure, consider them precious, for they are rarely met. Whenever others, due to their jealousy, you see, that rarely met. See, this is a terrible one. I hate this one. See, there are three major virtues to develop the body of compassion of Buddhahood. Generosity, morality, or justice, as we could translate it, and tolerance, as I prefer to translate it, although some people say patience, but I prefer tolerance. And in order to cultivate those three virtues, for generosity, you have to have someone to whom you can give things. Or if you don't actually give them, you have to develop the willingness to give them somehow, because generosity can be cultivated without actually laying a bunch of things on people, but you have to be wanting to. Morality, you need others because morality means, justice means treating others justly, that is to say sensitively, exactly how they are due, appropriately, not exploiting them, not using them in some way, being correct with them. What is correct in your interrelationship is morality. Other regarding behavior, as they call it in the West. I think it's a good definition. And for that you need beings, any beings who, beings who themselves, you could actually, to develop the virtue of morality, you have to have beings whom you could treat unjustly, but you then do not. You treat them rightly, well, appropriately. But then the third one is the hard one. To practice tolerance, you have to have beings who injure you. You have to have enemies. You have to have people who don't like you, who give you difficulties. And the real person who gives you a really hard time is therefore a real treasure. This is the teaching. One of my teachers, after I had studied Buddhism for at least 20 years, and one even hesitates to discuss this in a group because there's so many people who might get the wrong idea. But he said, if we were really practicing Buddhism, if we were really seeking higher being, when we get up in the morning and come downstairs, if we found our worst enemy sitting in there in our kitchen, we would be ecstatically happy. And in fact, you can just test yourself. Would you rather have your worst enemy there, or would you rather have some guy giving you the lottery prize? The worldly way, much better to have the lottery prize. Dharma way, much better evolutionarily to have the person to put you to the challenge, put you to the test, to develop your tolerance. Tolerance is the source of your strength, of your vigor, of your beauty, of your lovingness, your ability to withstand injury without hatred is what tolerance is. Not to react to injury by hatred. It means tolerance. And this is what he's talking about. Whenever others, due to their jealousy, revile and treat me in other unjust ways, may I accept this defeat myself and offer the victory to them. When someone whom I have helped, or in whom I have placed great hope, harms me with great injustice, may I see that one as a sacred friend. In short, may I offer both directly and indirectly all joy and benefit to all beings, my mothers, and may I myself secretly take on all of their hurt and suffering. This is the meditation of give and take, taking away from others their suffering, giving my joy and benefits to them. May they not be defiled, may these beings not be defiled by the concepts of the 8 mundane concerns, that is, success and failure, praise and blame, etc. These are these things. May other beings not worry and be anxious over those things, and may they be aware that all things are illusory, and may they, ungrasping, be free from bondage. Now this really is the community. You know. What is it that we want to see? This is the more deep evolutionary way to address the concept of Buddhahood, you know, of total enlightenment. Total enlightenment, for example, they say, whenever you do a good thing in the Mahayana, you dedicate the virtue of what you did to the happiness of all other beings. When you say, you don't just directly say the happiness, but because you might be confused with some sort of temporary pleasure, and what you mean by that is I dedicate it to my Buddhahood, which can then become the happiness of all beings. And their happiness finally is their Buddhahood. But in order for you to help create that, you have to become perfectly happy yourself, which you can only do by becoming a Buddha. Total happiness is Buddhahood, is freedom, is bliss, void, indivisible. They have all kinds of great names for it. It's the union with the entire universe in a state of total bliss. But, so then why dedicate every good thing that I do? Every good thing that I do is leading to that state. Every good thing that I do, when I give something to someone, it is like releasing something, releasing some bit of my armor of myself. And it is raising them, their pleasure even for a moment. But it isn't really then them possessing it, of course. It's sort of, so we don't, you know, the giving doesn't want to think necessarily about them possessing, just about their happiness in receiving. When I bear the injury from another tolerantly, then the injury comes away from them. And they see it absorbed in a way where it doesn't react in the same way. Then they question, then they lose the leverage of why they committed that injury. Because they don't, it goes into a void kind of, it's like, it exhausts their injuring habit. When I'm just exact and appropriate with them, moral and empathetic, then our interaction becomes more and more sensitive, more and more courteous, more and more gracious. Each motion and each interaction becomes more and more mutually beneficial. Ethics is like that. And so therefore that is community, you see. That is this kind of a community. If we are each other, if we are equally each other, but we have long lived in a state of mutual conflict and tension, because we have long been laboring under the delusion that we were more than you. Each of us thought I was more than you. Then the more we make you more than me, the more we are approximating the condition of our total mutual enlightenment, when we will all be all in all to all of each other. That is community. Don't you think? You think of 5 enemies, or 10, people who have injured us. And people, we had done some trampling or some mistake or some bad expression or some carelessness or some callousness. 10 people thought of us, could think of us that way. And somehow that we all had that dharma that said somehow, let them have the victory. That is the victory, is let them have the victory. Take the defeat myself. Somehow everybody giving everybody else the victory. It's like the reversal of the negative evolutionary interactive pattern that is, you know, the pig and the cock and the snake, that drives the wheel of unenlightened existence, of mutual suffering, mutual causing of suffering. Because our Buddhahood is when we will experience each other, when we do experience each other as if we were all limbs of the same body, as Shantideva said. We are all somehow some body. I mean, Christianity has it. They call it the mystical body of Christ. Don't they? Everybody's like one body through the sacrifice of one person. You know, which even if any way it could happen would be good enough. But here, this is rather the Christian thing of the imitatio Christi, the imitation of it, where everyone is willing to kind of give their awareness, give their attention. Not necessarily give everything. That's always so easy. People always, especially people who are somewhat conditioned to think that in essence they don't exist, like we all do. All of us brought up in our materialistic society have a little bit the habit of thinking, I mean, even if we may not be aware of it, that we don't really exist. Because some guy in a white coat tells us that we don't. The high priest, you know, the biologist, the physicist, the supposed great realists of our society, the guys who get the biggest salaries on the campuses, they tell us that we don't really exist. That we humanists who think that maybe there is a soul or something, human being, and of course they're very disappointed when they discover a Buddhist who says, yeah, we do have a soul. Yeah, we have no self, but we have a soul. It's a selfless soul, but it's a soul. We are not nothing. So people, when they subliminally feel they're nothing, and therefore subliminally feel they're sort of nothing to fear even from death because they'll just become nothing, they sort of like to jump to some idea of, yeah, I'll give myself, you know. That's actually easy. Especially if you're carrying around the idea that that's just like falling asleep. You know, no. But to give the victory to someone when you're arguing with them, to give the victory to someone who has given you trouble, who you have judged, you are righteous, they are wrong, they are your enemy, they are no good, they deserve this and deserve that. Let them have the victory. Completely changes the dynamic of our interconnection. Why did the Dalai Lama say that amazing thing? It shocked me so much because I hadn't heard that particular saying. All my years have been, like a wounded animal, retreat to my lair and be left alone quietly to lick my wounds. Which is the transcendence person who at least feels they can't cope with it, and they want to find this higher thing. The wound of egotistical interaction is just too much to bear. And they want some peace from that, withdrawal, to be able to open up their own sensitivity somehow and heal themselves, at least themselves. See? I mean, here we sit together tonight, and we think about the preposterous idea that we might become a community someday, in some world, in some life, where we lived for the highest fulfillment and fruition of all of each other, where we were all in all to all of each other, and where each of us felt absolutely precious to every other one of us as well. It's not just some big doormat trip. I mean, but, you know, let a few people become heroic doormats to get it rolling. You know, to disarm a situation, somebody has to unilaterally disarm at some point. But we are talking about a time of such an interconnectedness. And, you know, in the inner unfoldment of wisdom, seeing through even the unreality of time as a thing in itself, this future moment, when all of our Buddha natures have emerged and we are all Buddhas in this sense of selflessly joyful and therefore totally altruistic and loving to all of each other, then, you know, that is a delightful prospect. And in fact, the more we use the wisdom, it becomes more and more immediate and more possible. And then whenever we're getting somewhere great with it, give it away to everyone else, you see. I dedicate it, get it off. So I'm not holding on to evaluating it. Have I got a good state now? Am I feeling enlightened now? Do I feel loving now? Have I done it enough now? Well, now I can be great. No, keep giving it away. It is something fantastic. Even as a delusion, it's a great delusion. But it is not a delusion. So finally, this dual community operates on 3 levels in every culture in which it exerts its influence. Revolutionary on the cool and inner revolutionary sense, evolutionary on the educational sense, and fruitional or millennial. Buddha is as Buddha does. That's the old English proverb. Just be happy, at least act enlightened, feel enlightened. It is more pleasant, and enlightenment itself will follow. So that's the dual community. Okay?